Hello, and welcome to episode 17 of Arbiter of Worlds. If you're a returning subscriber, thanks for supporting the channel. If you're new to the channel, thanks for coming by. Here at Arbiter of Worlds, we study the art and science of running and creating tabletop role-playing games. So let's get into it. Today we're going to discuss the design challenges of mass combat in fantasy games. Before we dive in, though, I need to make two disclosures. First, mass combat, epic battle, has been an obsession of mine since I was a teenager. It led me to study military history at West Point, where I became adjutant of the West Point War Games Committee. It led me to design my first game, Modern Spearhead, which was a division-level miniature war game using 6mm microarmor to simulate Cold War battles. It led me to consult to the U.S. Army War College on war game design. In short, I love mass combat. I find it fascinating. I'm something of an expert on it. And I'm going to take for granted that it's awesome fun. If you don't care for mass combat, then this video is not going to try to persuade you that you should. My premise is that most people would actually enjoy the ability to do mass combat epic battles in their fantasy RPGs, if they could. Second, the reason I'm making today's video is that my game, Adventure Conquer a King System, has essentially solved all of the design challenges that I'm going to raise that are posed by introducing mass combat into fantasy role-playing. Yet, mass combat continues to be presented online as if it were either an unsolved dilemma or something that was solved in 1971. And neither of those statements is true. It makes me feel like Isaac Newton chilling in a tavern. People are like, why do apples fall from trees? And half the tavern says it's not worth thinking about, and the other half is quoting Aristotle's theory that earth and elements fall to earth, and meanwhile Newton has invented the infinitesimal calculus to explain how this works. It's frustrating. Hence, today's video. So let's start with the first challenge, which is the problem of scale. What makes a combat a mass combat? Large numbers of troops. Nowadays, your typical tabletop RPG battle has 3 to 6 player characters up against a solitary boss monster with perhaps a few minions, maybe against a small warband of orcs or other humanoids, perhaps a couple dozen combatants on the battlefield at most. In old school D&D, when the combat rules were a bit simpler, it was not uncommon for the players to field 10 to 20 characters, including henchmen, and the game often challenged them with several dozen enemies at once. But battle with 100 combatants is still not a mass combat. In wargame parlance, that's a skirmish, and it would be handled with a skirmish-level rule set, of which Dungeons & Dragons is effectively an exemplar. D&D was originally a war game, or rather, it used the rules for a war game called Chainmail. Chainmail was designed by Gary Gygax and Steve Perrin back in 1971 to be, quote, a war game for medieval miniatures. Chainmail was originally designed for use with 40mm miniatures at 1 to 20 scale, which means that each miniature represented 20 warriors, and then allow you to run a battle of a few hundred to a few thousand warriors per side. When original Dungeons & Dragons was published, Gygax recommended that chainmail be used to adjudicate combat for the game, but he said do it at 1 to 1 scale, where each miniature represents 1 warrior, and then some of those at the 1 to 1 scale would be the player characters, and then a 4th level hero had the fighting power of 4 warriors, and so on. But since Chainmail was originally a 1 to 20 scale game, some canny DMs could, and they did, scale back up from 1 to 1 to 1 to 20 whenever they wanted to run larger battles in their old school RPGs. And so out of the box, the original D&D was actually compatible with wargame play at scales of a few hundred to a few thousand warriors on the battlefield. And this is why the gentlemen of the Bro SR can honestly assert that D&D is a wargame that has mass combat built in, because it does, to an extent. But Chainmail does not go far enough. When we look at history, the battles that mattered were invariably scaled at the level of tens of thousands of combatants. An estimated 150 to 300,000 soldiers fought at Gaugamela. 120,000 fought at Cannae, 20 to 40,000 fought at Agincourt, 15 to 20,000 fought at Hastings. Those are the sort of battles that I've always wanted to see fought in world-shaking epic fantasy campaigns. And none of those battles could be simulated by Chainmail, nor by its successor, the AD&D battle system, nor by any other role-playing game except ACKS, which already does that. In ACKS, you can run battles at party level, where each character is simulated, at platoon scale, where each unit represents 30 men, at company scale, where each unit represents 120 men, at battalion scale, where it's 480 men per unit, or at brigade scale, where it's 1,920 men per unit. And you can field 50 to 100 units on a side. Whatever scale you choose, all of the PCs and NPCs' attributes and abilities get factored into their effectiveness on the battlefield. The math works at every level, such that a 14th level fighter is relatively more powerful at platoon scale than at brigade scale, as he should be. ACKS is the only game where you could field Hannibal as a 14th level fighter in command of 50,000 troops, play out the Battle of Cannae, and also have Hannibal duel Scipio if you wanted. Now, solving this problem of scale is what we might call non-trivial. Not only do you have to deeply understand the one-to-one math of the combat system, you also need to understand how ancient and medieval troops fought. You need to take into account matters like formation, unit depth, morale, maneuver. You have to work out how the PC's characteristics are translated on the battlefield. How much does intelligence matter? Charisma, armor class, hit points, number of attacks, damage over time. And the answers change at every scale. Now, of course, a fantasy battle at the scale of Cannae or Agincourt is going to be even more complex than that because of the problem of magic. Since we're talking about fantasy gaming, we're talking about a world where sorcerers could fling fireballs, undead could be raised from the earth, strongholds could be wrecked by miraculous earthquakes, and that leads to the second design challenge. Is it even possible to simulate large-scale historic battle fought in the ancient medieval world while also simulating high magic? Are those two design goals even compatible? After reviewing the many ways magic has appeared in various fantasy war games and military fiction, I've concluded there's basically three schools of thought, three approaches. At one extreme is the magic as machine guns school. And here, spells are as common as machine guns, so each squad has at least one and possibly several. Clerics are as common as medics, griffins are as common as fighter jets, and the result is what we might call World War II of the Rings. It's, elven cloaked snipers unleashing lightning bolts on unsuspecting foes while an air force of wyvern riders drops firebombs. Now, there's good news and there's bad news with regard to the magic as machine gun school. The good news is that you don't need any rules for mass combat. The bad news is that you won't have any mass combat. Since the 1940s, military analysts in the tradition of Michael Dupuy have known that when firepower increases, troop density decreases in inverse correlation. So when the level of firepower reaches 20th century proportions, machine guns, pitched battles disappear. At no point does anyone ever assemble well-dressed battle lines of phalanxes. You don't have mass combat. You have a series of skirmishes happening over a wide area at the same time. You have small unit tactics. Now, a lot of new school gamers take magic as machine guns by default because that's the level of magic that's essentially implied by the 3rd, 4th, and 5th editions of Dungeons & Dragons. And so for gamers who want that level of magical firepower, the concept of mass combat might be irrelevant, and that's fine if that's what they want. But if you want to experience Aragorn at Helm's Deep, you can't get that when magic is treated like machine guns. Now, at the other extreme is the magic as atomic bomb school. And here, magic is very feared, it's occasionally very powerful, but you rarely see it on the conventional battlefield. This school imagines that most battles are more or less identical to the sort described in history. The fate of kingdoms is decided by spears and phalanxes, and magic rarely has a direct place on the battlefield, although it can occasionally end a war entirely by poisoning the king or spoiling the crops. And this school of thought appears in a lot of fantasy fiction. You see it in Conan, Lord of the Rings, Song of Ice and Fire, First Law. All of these feature massive battles fought in the shadow of magic rather than with magic. But those sort of worlds have not been as popular among tabletop RPG players. And there's good reasons for that, which we'll go into in another episode. TLDR, more magic creates more niches, and more niches makes more fun for all. Okay, in between these two extremes is what I call the magic as canon school. And here, mages are about the equivalent of artillery batteries in the Napoleonic era, both in terms of their numbers and their importance. They can be kept massed as grand batteries. They can be parceled out to individual units as battalion guns. In either case, they're very feared. The side that possesses more of them has an important advantage, just as in the 19th century, the side with more cannons had a potent advantage. But they are still rare enough and their volume of firepower limited enough that battles are primarily fought by massed ranks of soldiers taking and holding ground with their personal weapons. And this school of magic appears in a lot of fiction. We see it in Wheel of Time, we see it in The Prince of Nothing and the Aspect Emperor trilogies. There's lots of magic and lots of mass troop formations. And magic as cannons is, I think, the appropriate level of magic for a role-playing game that wants to feature mass combat. And that's how I approach designing ACKS. But this is another non-trivial problem. To make magic as cannons work, you need to fine-tune not just the power of each spell, not just the number of spells per day per caster, but also the number of spellcasters relative to the rest of the world. And if you get any step wrong, you end up with magic as atomic bombs or magic as machine guns. As an example of how subtle some of this can be, in basic and advanced D&D, a fireball had a radius of 20 foot. And that enabled it to cover approximately 1,200 square feet, which is an enormous area. It's enough to wipe an entire company of troops off the map. In ACKS, a fireball has a diameter of 20 feet, which means it covers about 300 square feet, or about a platoon of troops. If you're just playing at 1-to-1 scale in the dungeon, this is not a nerf. The 20-foot diameter fireball is actually great. It's better than the big fireball because it's easier to use in small rooms. But it makes a 400% difference on the battlefield in terms of the power of wizards. Here's another example. In ACKS, your local baron's castle could be easily devastated by an 11th level mage with Disintegrate and Move Earth. Easy. But does that mean that castles are useless? No, because in ACKS we know the demographics of heroism, and so we know there's only about one 11th level mage per million people. There's like 4,000 barons for every mage of that caliber. And so those 4,000 castles are not threatened by the existence of this one wizard. In fact, the reason that ACKS provides all of this demographic data is in order to make sure that the mass combat works in the system. If you care at all about verisimilitude in simulation, you can't just wave your hands and say, oh, there's just enough wizards to have some magic during wartime, but not enough to prevent mass combat. How many wizards is that? How powerful are those wizards? If I'm king of the realm and I muster all my wizards, how many can I conscript? You need to be able to answer those questions. If you're just making it up, you're not offering real agency to the player because this entire war effort is subject to your whim. And that brings us to the third design challenge of mass combat: logistics. Logistics is a complex topic. For our purposes, it can be reduced to the following principles. 1, soldiers have to come from somewhere. They don't appear out of thin air. 2, soldiers have to be paid. They don't work for free. 3, soldiers have to be fed. They need a lot of food. And 4, soldiers have to be moved to the theater of combat. So the troops, the money, and the food have to get from their source up to the battle lines. And that's logistics. And logistics is also a non-trivial design challenge. Most fantasy fiction has terrible logistics. You see armies essentially appear from nowhere, they eat nothing, they teleport to the field of battle, and they fight. Writers of the Game of Thrones TV show, I am looking at you, and you sucked at this. Now, most fantasy game designers are, better informed, but they don't spend much time writing rules for this. Why is that? Well, there's a popular adage in military circles that states, amateurs study strategy and tactics, professionals study logistics. And it's true. Strategy and tactics are fun. It's awesome to contemplate the acumen of Alexander the Great as he waits for the perfect moment to charge with the companion cavalry into the gap in the Persian line created by the engagement with Parmenian's echelon wing. It is a lot less fun to count the number of wagons that Bob the quartermaster had to use to carry the oats to feed the horses of the companion cavalry so they could make the charge. But it's necessary. If you're supposed to be playing Conan, King of Aquilonia, and you're going to war with Stygia, the game rules need to tell you how many troops you can raise. They need to tell you how much it will cost to field your army, how much food they'll eat each week, how far they can march. What if Conan's army gets cut off from its supply base and it wants to start foraging for food from the local granaries? How much food can they get from 500 peasants? How about 5,000 peasants? What if Conan was to recruit the younger sons of the peasantry to join his army? How many fresh conscripts can he get? How many of those conscripts will have the strength to wear heavy armor or the eyesight to shoot a bow? How long will it take to train them? There need to be mechanical answers to all of these questions, or you can't really simulate the logistics that lead to mass combat. You can narrate mass combat, you can hand-wave mass combat, but you can't simulate it in a living world with player agency unless the rules provide what you need to account for the maneuvers and the shenanigans of armies and army leaders. A lot of systems purport to handle logistics, but they do it by treating the army asset as an entire different spectrum, which doesn't interact with and doesn't scale from one-to-one all the way up. In fact, this is essentially where every RPG fails, except ACKS, which already does all of this. And again, this is why ACKS has such a robust economic system. It's not that I want you to play Gordon Gekko Man from Wall Street. It's that I want you to have military logistics that make sense. Now, I get accused of being autistic sometimes, which I'm not, but thank you. What I am is a professional. If I'm going to give you the rules that purport to allow you to run mass combat, then those rules will actually do so. And if that means I have to study a 500-page treatise on Roman game supply to get the answers I need, then I will read the stupid treatise on Roman grain supply, and I will work out what that means. And I don't expect the player to care about the exact details of the crop rotation system or to count the number of sheep in the local pasture. But as a game designer, I had to know those things in order to make the logistics system work, which it does. So, scale, magic, logistics. Those are the three design challenges that have to be solved if you want to simulate mass combat in your fantasy role-playing game. If this is a topic that interests you and you haven't read my rulebooks on mass combat, which are called Domains at War Battles and Domains at War Campaigns, check them out. Links are in the description below. There's nothing better on the market, and there won't be anything better on the market until ACKS Imperial Imprint launches. If this is a topic that really interests you, I could dive in deeper and perhaps show how we simulate some ancient medieval battlefield behavior in a future video. Let me know in the comments below. And please order your reserve troops to assault the like and subscribe button and ask your quartermaster to share this video with all of your allies. I will see you back on the battlefield next week.